slowly it became very evident that as I was growing older and opening my mouth more and more, I was endangering my family, I was endangering myself. And since I had a father who had left after the war and went to work eventually for Radio Free Europe in Munich, my mother and he, who were estranged, they'd been divorced, nonetheless got together on a plan to get me out of Hungary. And in October of 1953, they sent in, my father sent in a smuggler, a professional smuggler, who was paid $1,000 to bring me and 4 other adults across the Iron Curtain. And it was quite an adventure. It was sort of like a B-movie of the 50s. Richard Widmark, Dana Andrews, Inger Stevens, and all these characters sort of, how should I say it, not terribly in-depth characters, characterize it. We just left and we ran through minefields and booby traps, and everything had to be handled. And nobody had any regrets, because we were all convinced that this was simply going to be a massive concentration camp. And that's indeed what it became. My mother remained back there, my 2 sisters remained back there, and the only reason they managed to survive is that they put much of their energy into sports. And the communist governments of not just the Soviet Union, but Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Bulgaria and everything, they were very intent on showing the world that their athletes were superior to everyone else. They gave athletes all the perks you can imagine. They didn't have to go to work. They had summer camps at the most desirable places in the country. They were a pure propaganda machine. And most of us who had a little bit of intelligence could see that this was a fraud. There was nothing behind it. The country was in terrible shape. We were all poor. My mother had to bring her pea soup from work home to feed us. And so there was no illusion about the wonders, the wonderful promise of communism. And by the time I got out here, I was fairly prepared to embrace what I understood to be a roughly free society. Although I must say that in time I became appalled at how similar some of the Western intellectuals thought to those who were teaching us back in Hungary. Their depiction of, the commies' depiction of business is not all that different from what current business ethics textbooks depict business as rapacious, greedy, avaricious, thoughtless, heartless creatures, as if they were a special species. But at the time, I was mostly reared on novels by Zane Grey, by Mark Twain, by Earl Stanley Gardner. In fact, when I was in Hungary, I used to call myself Peri Machan. I didn't know how to pronounce Mason because I was so enthralled by those books. And it's interesting because right now, after 70 years or 60 years, I still watch Perry Mason reruns occasionally. Just it goes to show you that your childhood dreams do get realized sometimes in your adulthood. And so I came out and I lived for 3 years in Germany, and I started to go to American high school and get very Americanized. I was very pro-American. I mean, I was blindly pro-American. I didn't see any sign of American imperialism, because compared to what the Americans did when they were occupying Germany, the Russians were just a bunch of brutes. They ran Hungary like a concentration camp, whereas the Americans just sort of hung out in Germany, which is very different. Now, maybe in depth, you'd come up with a different history of this, but I'm talking about my perceptions here. And so I essentially, I became so avid about America that even while I was still in Germany, I've never yet set foot in the country, I began to propagandize in favor of America by going around Munich pretending to be an American with jeans and everything and speaking fluent German to impress the Germans that some Americans can do that, even though I was not an American, because I always thought that the Americans were a little naive about selling their virtues, so they didn't care about whether the Germans thought that it was kosher for them to speak German or not. I knew, however, that the Germans would be very impressed if they met some Americans who acquired fluency in the German language. So I did that. I don't know if I'm reading what my answer to that is back into my consciousness back then, but my recollection is that I always thought that you needed an integrated, holistic approach to the understanding of the world. It's not enough to have bits and pieces nailed down well. I suppose I was always in some ways an Aristotelian. When I was in the Air Force, before I ran across Rand, I ran across a series of books advertised in National Review. These were philosophy books. They included Locke and Aristotle and Plutarch and Montaigne and so on, and I read through all of these. And I remember taking the bus to work. I was a draftsman. At first I was an air policeman, then I was a draftsman in the Air Force. And I always had some time in my hand to read, and I always loved reading. And these books impressed me because they always wanted to cope with the big questions, or at least even with, let's say, Locke is talking about politics, but the fundamentals of politics, not public policy issues. And so I think that very early I became convinced that if you are going to come up with some kind of an account of the way things are and how they ought to be, you have to have a comprehensive view. It's not enough to just get good at one thing or another unless you integrate them. And then, of course, there was Aristotle, and I read Aristotle's Metaphysics again before I even ran across Ayn Rand, and I was just fascinated by the idea that there is such a thing as a study of being qua being, But it made perfectly good sense to me. Why not study what it is to just exist? Never mind existing as a chair or as an amoeba or as a whatever, just existing. I thought that was a big question, and it's worth learning because it'll give you a direction in how to appreciate all the other kinds of claims when people say that they've run across a ghost or they can see into the future or that they are clairvoyant and so on. All of this can be checked against metaphysics. I don't think there's any other field against which these kinds of claims can be successfully tested. Metaphysics is the best testing ground. At least it gives you the answer, is it at least possible? And so that immediately sucked me into philosophy. I was already at odds with the contemporary trends because almost all philosophical work at the time that I ran across as a graduate student, but even prior to that, was piecemeal. I remember having one of my professors wrote articles on words like and about. Little words. Now, actually, when you think about it, there's more to studying the locutions of like and about than it seems, but it looked sort of superficial. Later on, realized that there's some of these linguistic analysts weren't as superficial as I had feared, or as they appeared, but that was a subsequent development of my education.